In this segment, we're going to focus on World War I, or at the time they called it the Great War, or even the war to end all wars. It's going to last from 1914 to 1918 and wreak some of the worst devastation in human history to that point. American entry into World War I, once we finally got involved, did ensure an Allied victory. But how did we get there? Europe had become a powder keg. It was ready to explode. All it was going to take was a simple spark to set off one of the worst disasters that humanity has ever brought upon itself. As we take a look at the specific general causes of World War I, we need to consider the role of nationalism. That is to say, each nation was focusing on its own special self-interest rather than on the interests of each other. Ferociously pride of themselves and who they were. And that pride is going to blind them to the needs of the global community. There was also imperialism that was going on. We've already focused on American imperialism, but at the same time, Europe was engaged in competition for colonies and to control trade. We also have a rise of militarism. A literal arms race is going on across Europe. And this increased arms race and the use of military and the threat of the military is not going to be only the United States with the big stick. This is also going on constantly in Europe. We have pride people, we have imperialistic people, and we have people who are militarily armed. But to make matters worse, we had a strong system of alliances. Europe had literally formed into what we call two very large armed camps, and each one declaring that an action against any one nation would be considered an act on all. All of this is going to lead us with the military, with the competition, with the pride, and friends who are willing to beat up each other. Again, it's only going to take one little spark to set off this powder keg. And that spark actually happened. It was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. When this Austrian prince was visiting in the area that today is Bosnia, he was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. Austria demanded that Serbia apologize and offer reparations. Serbia declined and refused. An ultimatum was given. Serbia refused. Austria declares war on Serbia. And that is what sparked World War I. As we take a look at the map of military alliances during World War I, we see the red countries are the Allied powers. The purple countries are the Central powers. And so these are the ones who are in direct opposition. As you can see, the Central powers, the big ones including the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, are surrounded on two sides by the Allied powers, which included the Russian Empire, as well as Great Britain, France, Italy, and some other smaller countries. And you can see that all it takes is an attack on one nation to bring literally everybody else into it. Now notice there are several countries that are neutral. Spain, who wasn't ready to fight anybody after the whipping they took in 1898 at the hands of the Americans. Norway and Sweden were also going to set this one out. And very notably, right there in the center, Switzerland begins its long-standing tradition of staying neutral. The United States also wanted to stay neutral. There was very strong sentiments within the United States to completely stay out of this war, that it's not our business. It's going on overseas, and as long as they're not bothering us directly, as long as they're not interfering with our trade, we really shouldn't get involved. After all, many Americans are split. who should we support? We have immigrants who have come from the countries that are the Central Powers. We have immigrants who have come from countries that are the Allied Powers. We really can't play favorites. The best thing for us is to simply stay out of it. And the United States avoided that involvement. For 3 years after the outbreak of the war, the United States was able to stay neutral. President Woodrow Wilson even ran his 1916 political campaign on the phrase, "He kept us out of the war." And Woodrow Wilson promised to continue to keep America out of this war. However, the United States does ultimately join the fight in 1917. What caused us to change our minds? Well, it took quite a few things, and 3 years had passed. The Germans were using unrestricted submarine warfare and attacking American ships. They proclaimed that they were going to shoot any American ship that was entering into these forbidden waters out of fear that we were supplying weapons and ammunition to the Allied powers. Well, this is American lives being lost at sea, and American products were also going down. The sinking of the passenger ship Lusitania shocked many Americans. Over 100 American citizens were on this ship when it was struck by a German U-boat. And we claim that this was unacceptable to target a passenger ship, while the Germans claimed that Americans were smuggling in munitions on the Lusitania as it went on a trip from New York to London. The United States denied that claim. The Zimmerman telegram was another event that caused Americans to become very disappointed in what was going on. This is where Germany sent a secret telegram to Mexico asking them to wage war against the United States. If Mexico would wage war against us, that would distract us, this is what Germany thought, and would prevent us from getting involved in the war on their side. Therefore, if Mexico could keep us occupied long enough to keep us out of it, then Germany would turn and attack the United States in exchange for the territory that Mexico had lost in the Mexican War. Well, the United States received this telegram, published it in our newspapers, demanded an apology. Mexico, of course, said they would never think of doing anything like this, and Germany looked pretty bad. Also during this time, Americans felt a very strong social and economic connection to the Allied powers. Roughly 90% of American exports prior to World War I were going to the Allied powers, leaving only 10% going to the Central Powers. If we're going to make a decision based on economics, we need to side with the Allied powers. Russia was also in the midst of a civil war. They were going through their communist revolution during 1917, and we realized they were about out. And if you recall what that map looked like, if Russia bows out, that leaves only one front for the Central Powers to fight along. And of course, Woodrow Wilson believed that the United States needed to step up and make the world safe for democracy, that those Allied powers were not fighting for monarchies, they were fighting for now democratic governments. And if the United States felt that democracy was important to us, it should be important to others, and we needed to make the world safe for democracy. In 1917, the United States enters, and our entry into World War I is going to tip the balance. While things were at a stalemate on the battlefields when America declared war, now we were involved and we held the edge. The use of American resources, both at the front as well as behind the lines, are going to help tip the favor to the Allied powers. The infusion of fresh troops is going to bolster morale. It's going to make those French and British soldiers who had been fighting for years in the trenches feel a little bit better knowing that the Yankees are coming. Ultimately, fighting stopped on November 11th, 1918 with an armistice. The Central Powers agreed to stop fighting, to sit down and talk peace. An armistice is simply an agreement to stop fighting, and that happened on November 11th, 1918. Well, could this be a lasting peace? Is this going to be the war to end all wars? Will the Great One solve all the problems that had existed prior to World War I? And can we get along with all of us? We have seen great progress. This is the age where we should be past our traditional failures. Let's take a look at Woodrow Wilson's plan for a lasting peace and how it fit into the Treaty of Versailles, and then, of course, how the failure of the League of Nations is going to become a prevalent problem here in the future. And again, American entry into World War I ensured Allied victory. But, as you know, we did not conclude a lasting peace. And that failure is going to leave a very bitter legacy, which is going to be addressed in the next decades to come. Woodrow Wilson arrived in Paris and Versailles with a plan, what he called the 14 points. This is Wilson's plan for a lasting peace. What we are going to do is we are going to emphasize fixing the problems that led to the outbreak of this great war. The 14 points included things like self-determination, the idea that national boundaries should be drawn based on the people who lived there, and those people should be allowed to establish their own governments and secure their own future. One of the problems that led us to this war was nationalism, and nationalism is a problem if one nation's boundary goes over another group of people. And so self-determination for these nations is going to be essential to securing a lasting peace. Also, Woodrow Wilson insists that we have freedom of the seas, open trading to all peaceful nations in the world, that no nation should be able to hassle any economic activity of another nation. Also, Woodrow Wilson says there should be no more secret treaties, no more secret alliances, which is what led us into this great war. And when it came to our colonies, Woodrow Wilson says we need to set up a mandate system, how these colonies should be managed and set their own independence to allow these colonies to become independent nations in and of themselves. Woodrow Wilson advocated an arms reduction, that we don't need to have all this military power. When we have the power, we tend to want to use it against each other. And so if we all agree to reduce our weapons, we will not be able to hurt each other, and we will be less inclined to wage war. Now, Woodrow Wilson's favorite point was point number 14, where he wanted to create what's called a League of Nations. He had a vision that all nations should have a place where they could come together and discuss their problems, discuss their differences, and decide a peaceful solution rather than resorting to the military. After all, if these key ideas from the 14 points are followed, we will have a lasting peace. No reason to fight each other at all. Well, Woodrow Wilson went to Versailles armed with his 14 points. And in 1919, the Big Four met in Paris at the Palace of Versailles to negotiate this treaty. The Big Four included a guy named Lloyd George from Britain, Orlando from Italy, Clemenceau from France, and then, of course, Woodrow Wilson from the United States. Britain, France, and Italy did not have the same idea. They wanted to punish Germany and Austria and the Central Powers. They wanted to force them into complete submission. To them, you fight a war to make the other guy look bad and to take their stuff, and to hurt them so bad that they will never stand up against you again. Of course, the Central Powers needs, and even the Soviet Union, were not invited to the conference. They weren't invited to discuss. After all, Russia had become the Soviet Union during its communist revolution, and their needs were completely forgotten. Woodrow Wilson was forced to concede almost all of his 14 points. In the end, the Treaty of Versailles was a statement of vengeance. Many new nations were formed. The other three of the big four wanted to divide up the empires and create brand new nations. They didn't really give much concern to who lived where, so often national boundaries overlapped ethnic groups. The mandates, or these captured colonies, were seized by the Allies. Rather than put on a plan for quick independence and freedom, they were held by Britain, by France, and by Italy as a colony in order to make money. Germany was forced to pay war reparations, that is, financial. Germany was expected to pay $33 billion. And again, this is 1919 dollars as well. $33 billion to the Allies for damages. Germany was also forced to sign what's called the War Guilt Clause. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for World War I. Wait a minute. Didn't Austria declare war on Serbia? Yes, but it must have been Germany's fault somewhere. The League of Nations was enacted. The Treaty of Versailles did give Wilson this one point as a place for the nations to come together and negotiate a peaceful solution. So this League of Nations was actually formed. Through all the battles, Woodrow Wilson won this only 1 point. And as this image indicates, the League of Nations, well, Wilson thought it was a good idea. Those are tomatoes being thrown at Woodrow Wilson. Kind of wonder who's throwing them. You might think it could be the other people involved at the Treaty of Versailles, but that's more of a reflection of what was going on here in the United States, because many Americans opposed the treaty. Most felt that it was too punitive, that it punished Germany too much, that what we were doing was setting ourselves up for future anger that would be going on. Most Americans opposed the League of Nations, feeling that it was unwise for America to enter into a group that could tell us what our foreign policy should be. We didn't like an international organization telling us what to do when it came to other countries. The Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. We actually signed a different treaty, a separate treaty with Germany and Austria and the rest of the Central Powers. We refused to ratify the treaty, and even though Woodrow Wilson had the idea of this League of Nations, the Senate said no. We refused to join the League of Nations. And when we consider the weaknesses and the bitterness that was left over from the Treaty of Versailles, two very significant things happened as a direct result. Germany is humiliated, absolutely destroyed. The Allies, having ignored the needs of the Soviet government, is going to cause problems there. There's going to be international instability as many new nations were created. And when the Senate refused to join the League of Nations and we returned to our isolationist policies, the stage was set. These failures inevitably are going to lead to a global depression. That is a Great Depression suffered not just by the United States, but by every nation in the world. And World War II is going to be the inevitable outcome.